Ok. Bueno, primero que todo, muchas gracias a todos por estar acá, a los que nos acompañan en el auditorio y a los que nos acompañan vía remota. Estamos muy contentos por celebrar la tercera sesión de este seminario, que está asociado al Workshop OASIS, dirigido por el profesor Pablo Alfaro, que nos acompaña vía remota desde Michigan. Como les contaba, esta es la tercera sesión. Tuvimos la primera sesión hecha por Rodrigo Pérez de Arce. Luego la segunda sesión estuvo dirigida por Pablo y su socio Kushan Latwani. Y finalmente tenemos la tercera sesión que, donde nos va a hablar Ned Kahn. Entonces, ahora como les comentaba, Ned Kahn es un artista ambiental y escultor cuyo trabajo revela las fuerzas de la naturaleza invisibles, haciéndolas visibles para el público. Sus principales intereses incluyen la dinámica de fluidos, la óptica, la acústica y otros fenómenos físicos. Kahn trabajó como aprendiz de Frank Oppenheimer, el fundador del Museo Exploratorium en San Francisco, durante la década de 1980, y diseñó muchas exhibiciones atemporales para la institución. Continuó diseñando exhibiciones para museos como el Museo de Historia Natural de Nueva York, el Museo de Historia Natural de Londres, Inglaterra, el Museo de Arte de California en Pasadena y otros. También ha realizado numerosos encargos públicos, trabajando solo y con algunos de los mejores diseñadores y arquitectos del mundo, incluyendo a Moshe Safdie y Tom Osland. Estas obras a menudo integran las fuerzas del agua y el viento, utilizando edificios urbanos, muelles, parques infantiles, aeropuertos e incluso estacionamientos como lienzos. Su trabajo aparece en espacios públicos en Estados Unidos y en todo el mundo, con instalaciones permanentes en Australia, Singapur, Inglaterra, Suiza y los Países Bajos. Ned Kahn recibió una licenciatura en Botánica y Estudios Ambientales en 1982 de la Universidad de Connecticut y recibió la beca Genius de la Fundación MacArthur en 2003. Los dejo entonces. Pablo, no sé si tú quieres decir algo más aparte.
Sí, muy cortito. Tenemos el honor y el placer de tener a Ned Kahn aquí hoy día, aunque sea virtualmente. Esperamos en el futuro poder tenerlo en persona ahí en la escuela, en lo contador, y que nos dé esta charla o la charla de sus proyectos futuros. Pero Ned es una persona muy especial, muy brillante. Nada, para nosotros es un honor tenerlo acá. Para mí ha sido muy grato poder colaborar con él en el último tiempo. Así que muchas gracias, Ned, por aceptar la invitación. So thank you, Ned, for accepting this invitation to give a lecture today at MAPA UC. We are very honored to have you. And well, I won't say anything else, just take it away.
Well, thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Alejandra. Yeah, just a quick background. Maybe when I was in college, took a number of classes and got super interested in quantum physics, and just was super fascinated by the worldview that physicists were presenting, were studying, you know, the subatomic world. And you know, at the same time, I was also super interested in sculpture and art and architecture. And so I just got this inkling of an idea that it might be interesting to depict or be inspired by the worldview of quantum physics, extending that into the realm of art and architecture. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of videos of various kind of, I don't know, experiments, attempts to kind of depict that world. And The title of the talk, The Texture of Emptiness, was inspired by the fact that, when you speak to scientists who study the quantum world, they talk about how kind of everything in the universe has an underlying texture to it. And, sometimes they use the word, quanta. Sometimes they talk about granulation. But kind of everything in the universe, when you kind of zoom into it, magnify into it, has a texture to it. So, matter, the texture of matter is kind of these subatomic particles, and the texture of light is photons. Even space, even the emptiness of space has a texture to it. Gravity has a texture to it. And so, but all these textures that physicists talk about, they're not like a solid texture. They're always moving, fluid, changing, fluctuating, resonating. And so, so at the time, kind of thinking about all these things and thinking about sculpture and architecture, how most buildings, have such a solidity to them. There's such a defined edge between, the building and the environment, and traditional sculpture too, stone and bronze sculptures, and, just this defined object. But then when you look at the real world and you zoom into it, the edges are always fluctuating and changing and morphing. And so it just gave me this idea, like, what if we could dissolve the boundaries of architecture and the boundaries of sculpture? And so I'll show you some of my attempts to do that. And so let me turn off the music. All right, so the first project, this is a collaboration with an architect, Fred Fisher. This is in Los Angeles, Santa Monica. It's on top of a building that Fred designed. It's a science building. It's a really wonderful school in Santa Monica, and they wanted to make a rooftop garden that would encourage people to go hang out there. But it's, Los Angeles, the sun is very potent, and so they came to me, and Fred and I kind of hatched this idea of this shade structure that would be intimately tied in with the atmosphere of the Earth, but would also relate to this idea of kind of granulation and subatomic fields, and also relate to gravity. So the whole structure is a hyperbolic paraboloid shape. It's basically if you took a square frame and you folded it at the corners and then stretched a grid across it, you naturally generate this topological saddle shape. And so at each junction of the cables, there's a moving element that can rotate freely 360 degrees with the wind. And there are these thin aluminum elements that catch the light, that reflect the sky. But each one, because of the saddle curve that they're attached to, sits at a different angle. So each one has a different ratio of the force of gravity to the force of wind. So the whole sculpture becomes almost like a wind gravity map. And the idea was, for all these students studying science to create something that would be sort of an enigma, almost like a scientific experiment in need of interpretation. So not giving them a defined answer, just giving them something to puzzle over, something to use their own kind of sense of inquiry and creativity to try to think about and understand, but also something that you could just understand in a sensory way. And I've been super interested in this idea that we all have different kinds of intelligence. We have kind of our thinking, writing, word-based mind intelligence, but we also have a sensory intelligence. So you can look at a complex field of interacting elements like this, and you can comprehend it kind of with your eyes, with kind of your visual system. You can see the patterns, you can see the changing textures, and with the thought that those kind of insights can sometimes form the basis, the underpinnings for, you know, different kinds of thinking kind of laid on top of that. So with the idea that you can inspire kind of scientific thinking and artistic thinking just from a visual level. This is a similar line of thinking. This was an installation for a hospital in San Antonio, Texas. Facing west into the harsh afternoon sun, they needed some way of mitigating the harsh sunlight entering the building. The windows behind this artwork are all the waiting rooms of this hospital. And the architects were going to put these big stone fins to block the light, but I convinced them to do something more delicate, more changeable, more linked to the exterior environment. So each of these panels is about, you know, the length of a human arm, and they're perforated aluminum panels, and they're mounted on a tilted hinge. And the tilting of the hinge allows gravity to, when there's no wind, they come back to rest perpendicular to the face of the building. And when there is wind, they move side to side. And you can kind of see the movements are very slow. They're very almost like it's underwater, and many layers of visual data that you're taking in when you look at it. So you see the individual panels that are moving, but you also see their shadows kind of projected onto the wall behind it. You also see them bouncing light onto each other. This was the view from a distance. There's a busy roadway that goes by here, and so cars driving by get this glimpse. When we were installing this, people would drive by on the road, they'd see this and they'd pull over and come over to us. We were hanging from, you know, various equipment, putting up the pieces, and they would, almost everyone thought it was some high-tech computer controlled thing, and they were asking us what program we were running, and you know, it's, the reality of it is it's just a bunch of hinges. It's not that different than the hinges on your door of your house. And it's, you know, hinges have been something that's, you know, been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so just the combination of this super simple system, you know, just repeated on a you know, large number. So it ties in with this whole idea. The scientists use the term emergence. So, you know, if you have one element, you know, it has certain properties. If you have two, it has even more properties. And you have 10,000 of something, patterns emerge, and things that you could never predict from just looking at you know, one of the elements emerge. And so most of these artworks that I'm showing you have you know, some aspect of emergence as part of them. This was a recently completed project in also in Los Angeles. They built a crazy huge new football stadium, and this is one of the parking structures for that stadium. And we clad the building with I forget how many tens of thousands of these aluminum beams. They're again a hinge, a super simple hinge, super low friction bearings, so super long duration bearings that you never have to lubricate, and which is always, you know, you propose something with 1 million pieces in it, people are always nervous about, you know, longevity, and someone going to have to oil all these, we're going to have to replace all these. And so a lot of my work is building a mock-up and showing people this is going to be fine. This is going to last for a long time. This is going to survive a hurricane. This is not going to, you know, drive people crazy. And but again, this, you know, a super brutal piece of necessary architecture, a parking structure, brutal concrete, brutal, just, you know, cheap. You know, we make this giant building as cheaply as we can, and you end up with this brutal thing. so then the challenge becomes, how can you make it something else? How can you soften it? How can you dissolve its boundary between the environment? How can you make it into something changeable and beautiful? This is something new that I'm working on, kind of a similar idea of kind of this moving elements with a kind of vertical grain to it. This is a mock-up for Google's new headquarters in Sunnyvale. We're wrapping a massive parking structure in a skin like this. So we're in the middle of constructing this. If you were to come visit my studio, you would see rolled up in the corner these giant cable nets with there's going to be 100,000 of these kind of pendulums that clip onto the cables and move in the wind. And again, as a metaphor for Google's whole kind of infrastructure, the idea that anywhere on the planet there's millions of people tapping into Google's network and doing their own searches, using it for their own individual journey through it. But then there's kind of global sort of patterns and emergence happening. And so the parking garage facade becomes a metaphor for Google's whole kind of system. A similar piece, this was for Zeiss, the company, the optical lens company. This was for a research development laboratory for Zeiss. And this piece, forget how many tens of thousands of counterbalanced elements. And the idea was to kind of mimic some of the dynamics of the wind blowing through tall grasses. And so each element, there are these aluminum reflective elements. So as the wind moves them, they catch different degrees of light and color from the sky. And they're all set into a pool of water. And the water system is part of a whole rain collection system, purification system. The whole site where this building was a wetland. And so when they constructed the building, they had to kind of mitigate the effects of the building and the landscape on the whole kind of water system. So this pool becomes kind of a place to capture rain, to purify rain, and the artwork actually functions as kind of a partial shade from the hot sun, so it keeps the water from overheating. It makes the sort of biological filtration of the water. It augments that. So it essentially takes the place of what tall water grasses would do in a natural riparian ecosystem. But again, you can see how, if you just had one of these elements and you were looking at it, it would be interesting. But when you have tens of thousands of them, it becomes much more interesting. One of my scientist friends gave me the analogy of if you were an alien on another planet where there was no water, and someone from our planet gave you one molecule of water, you could study that one molecule for a lifetime, and you'd never be able to predict all the amazing things that water does on Earth. You'd never be able to imagine the dynamics of an ocean. You'd never be able to imagine clouds or snow or all the forms that ice take, and mist, and a drop of dew on the tip of a leaf. And so all those miraculous properties and forms of water that we know come about by the interactions of trillions of water molecules interacting with each other. And so the information of how beautiful an ocean is just not in one molecule of water. It's in all of its interconnections with all of the other molecules that surround it. And so some physicists believe that in the physical universe, the only thing that's that's truly real are the interactions that it's not like there's particles interacting with other particles. The interactions are the only thing that really exists in the universe. And so I'm super intrigued with that idea and with the idea of creating an artwork where it's just the interactions that become the essence of it. And so it's very contrary to the usual traditional way people think about art and sculpture and architecture. And it's something that people have a hard time wrapping their heads around. It's very counterintuitive to the way we normally experience everyday objects in the world. This is a project that we just finished a couple of weeks ago. This is in Phoenix, Arizona, a basketball arena. And again, you know, a lot of my work is kind of mitigating like super horrible pieces of architecture. This is it's been famous for decades as being the worst arena in the whole you know, basketball league. Just a horrible building built back in the 80s. And so the city wanted the owner to tear it down, and he didn't want to tear it down. So he wanted the city to give him money to build a new stadium, and they said no. And so after years of fighting with each other, I was the plan B. They came to me and said, can you cover this thing? And so we covered it with, again, hundreds of thousands of these tiles that move in the wind. And each tile has a beautiful coating on it that allows it to register different colors depending on the angle that the light and the wind hits it. So it's almost like there's no real color to this. It's all the interactions create the color. So you can see browns and reds and whites, and every one of those tiles is exactly the same. So the only thing that's changing it is the wind and the angle that you're viewing it and the light that's coming from the sky. And so the team, the basketball team that plays in this arena, they're the Phoenix Suns. And so the inspiration was fire, like all the different hues of color from fire. Like how could we create an artwork that very abstractly kind of celebrates how beautiful fire is, but you know, without making people feel like the building is actually on fire. One of the things that's interesting, especially in this view that we're looking at right now, you also see the wind going through the building and interacting with the facade. So what you're really seeing is the building's interaction with the atmosphere. It's like, I mean, you're kind of seeing the natural wind, but it's really the interaction with the architecture of the natural wind that you're seeing. So again, this idea of revealing these interactions rather than an object, or rather than the building itself. So when you start kind of visualizing the wind on the scale of architecture, just there's often surprises, just the way wind passes through buildings, the way it peels around corners. So a lot of these artworks, you know, are almost like scientific experiments. They're almost like you've created a window around something that's normally invisible. And this is a mock-up for a huge project we're currently fabricating in Paris. A new train station is under construction in Paris, and we're experimenting with a blue color changing version of those red tiles that I showed you on the stadium. So if you can imagine a blue version of that in this kind of hammock-like structure that basically traces out the footprint, the underground footprint of this train station. This is a rendering of it. So the whole thing is huge. It'll be the largest artwork in Paris. And basically they're redoing the whole Paris metro. And So this is a whole new station, and every station, there's 60 new stations, and each station has a different architect, a different artist working on it. This one is in a part of Paris called Maison Blanche, which is kind of one of the few neighborhoods in Paris where like artists and, you know, can afford to live. So it actually is kind of it's a cool place to live. The rest of Paris has become super expensive and gentrified. So, and this part of Paris is far away from the river, the Seine, that runs through Paris, which in my opinion is like the thing that really makes Paris amazing, is the river. And so, but this community doesn't have the river. So I wanted to give them, you know, something like the river. So when you're coming up the stairs or the escalators of the train station, all you'll see is this canopy. So it's almost like you're emerging underneath the river. And for all the people who live in the big buildings surrounding it, you know, they'll have kind of almost like a river view. And then walking underneath it, the light and the shadows, this whole idea of kind of dappled light, kind of the way light, the kind of light that filters through the leaves of trees. When you have a grid of kind of these leaf-like elements moving in the wind, you get this dappled light, but the dappled light kind of transmits those waves and patterns and emergent patterns of the wind. This is a similar idea. This is a project in New York, Coney Island, an aquarium. And they originally hired me. They wanted some kind of screen to block all the mechanical equipment that they had to put up on the roof of the building to keep the aquarium tanks, you know, the right temperature and salinity and filters. And the project kind of grew to me talking him into, what if this distraction, this disguise for the mechanical equipment also wrapped around the whole building and kind of became the whole entryway into the building too, kind of the whole organizing exoskeleton of the building. So a lot of these public art projects, you know, people have something in mind and they get me involved, and I sort of feel like it's my responsibility to try to talk them into doing something grander and more amazing and more all-encompassing. I mean, a lot of architects are nervous about having an artist involved. And so, you know, they try to like give you one little corner to work on. Here's your wall, you know, do something there. And I've resisted that. And I've kind of tried to push them to like, you know, do something more amazing. And with limited success. So I'm showing you the ones that have worked out. I'm not showing you all the ones where they basically nodded and pointed me back to the wall that they wanted me to decorate. This is a project in Seattle. This was a similar thing, a power plant, a power substation. And the only place they could put it was kind of right in this neighborhood. And all the neighbors were furious that they're going to have to look at a power substation. And the electrical company said, don't worry, we're going to get an artist in to cover it. And it was just going to be kind of a, you know, a screen. And but I talked him into this much more complicated kind of folded geometry, and turned into kind of a piece of architecture rather than just a screen. But all the individual elements that move in the wind, they're all linked to the electrical grid that's running through this power plant. And so each moving element has a tiny magnet in it. And as the wind blows them in one direction, the magnetic field turns on an orange light. And when the wind blows in another direction, it turns on a deep blue light. So the idea was to convert the directionality of wind into colors. And so the whole building becomes kind of this register for the atmosphere, but also kind of suggests what happens inside the substation. And so the artwork is essentially a million switches. And so the idea was kind of to take the whole metaphor of an electrical grid and kind of make it visible. Similar line of thinking, but involving water instead of wind. This is the surface of a cooling tower in Singapore, collaboration with Moshe Safdie, the architect. So this cooling tower, the only place they could put it was kind of right near the main entrance to this hotel convention center complex. And they just wanted me to kind of cover this cooling tower, but I got intrigued with the actual functioning of the cooling tower, where they basically run water down through air and the evaporation cools the water, and then they take that cool water and that augments their air conditioning system. So I talked them into running water down the exterior of the building and instead, and revealing kind of the functioning of this cooling tower. A similar line of thinking, this was for a fancy art themed hotel in Louisville, Kentucky, running water down a matrix of spoons, little plastic spoons, so that we modified so that they essentially become hinges, and just a small amount of water drips down and you know, catches into the spoons, kind of causes them to tilt and redirect the water into the spoon below them. So again, you know, a whole matrix of repeating elements that influence each other. And so you know, if you just had one of these, it would be sort of interesting, but to have a whole wall of them almost becomes like a biological system, almost becomes like, you know, fish swimming or birds flying, or the cilia on the membranes of cells, and makes a beautiful sound. So this is the kind of an entry piece into this hotel. Another water piece. This was also for that same project in Singapore with Moshe Safdie. He needed a skylight over this area where there was going to be a bunch of restaurants and shops, and so he gave me the skylight and said, do something cool with the skylight. And it was going to be a dome. And I said, what if it's a bowl instead? And what if we collect rain? And what if we channel the rain into this and make a huge vortex? So it'll almost be like a piece of the ocean, and then let it pour down through the center and let it fall into the building and make a whole series of canals that would collect the rainwater and channel it through the architecture. And so Moshe loved the idea, his team loved the idea, and originally it was just going to be powered by the rain. There was a huge surface area of rooftop that would collect rain. And Singapore, almost every day there's a downpour in the afternoon. And so the idea is that whenever it rained, this vortex would come alive. And when we presented to the owner, he was upset that we were spending millions of dollars on this and it was only going to work when it rains. And so he basically overruled us and had them put in a recirculating system that pumps the water back up from the canal into the bowl so that it runs, you know, all the time. It runs on about a 20-minute cycle. It fills and drains. But it was a little bit of a letdown because it went from being this thing that was just going to be powered by the rain and the atmosphere to, you know, something that required these huge pumps and huge, you know, filters and all this power. And, but again, having to interface with, you know, clients and codes and engineers and, you know, even the best ideas, you know, can encounter, you know, just get watered down, so to speak.
So this right here is a water.
This is a project in San Francisco. I designed this rooftop garden in collaboration with landscape architect Peter Walker and an architect Cesar Clark Pelli. I talked them into the idea of this rooftop park. I was part of the competition and that won the competition for this. And the idea is that, so it's a transit center. So buses drive through the building, and in the rooftop, the ceiling of where the buses drive through, we put in these sensors. They're essentially motion detectors, and each one is linked to a nozzle in the fountain. So as the buses move in the level below the park, they activate the water. So you get a real-time image of whatever the bus is doing gets converted into water. And so so the sensors there, it's an ultrasonic beam that projects down, and whenever the bus interrupts that beam, it opens a valve directly above it in the fountain. So, and the whole thing is huge. It's 8 city blocks long. And so, so while you're in this park, you know, at first it's an enigma. You know, you just see these pulses of water kind of, you know, progressing across the park. And slowly people start to figure out that it's actually the buses, because when the bus stops to load people, the water keeps running and kind of, you know, just gives you this almost like an impression in water of what the buses are doing. And then slowly the bus drivers have figured out that, you know, as they're driving through this building, they're also kind of choreographing this fountain. So, so it becomes sort of an unintentional creative outlet for the bus drivers. And so this park is, it's about 4 stories above the level of the rest of the city. So it's surprisingly quiet up there. You're above all the street noise, and it's become a wonderful kind of refuge for people who live in, you know, the heart of the, you know, busy giant buildings of San Francisco, a little place of nature. This is also involving water, but in the form of fog. This is an installation in Pittsburgh. So a series of columns, stainless steel columns that are pressurized with water. And they have these fog sprayers arranged in basically a sphere that's embedded in kind of the cubical shape of the whole array. And so every 5 minutes, the fog turns on. It initially creates a perfect sphere of fog, but then that quickly gets warped by whatever wind forces and drifts around the whole park. And it runs for 2 minutes, and then it turns off, and for about 3 minutes while the fog evaporates. And so the piece has a lot of different elements of things that I'm intrigued with. Again, this idea of kind of granulation, the repetitive elements of the columns, the repetitive elements of all the tiny little drops of water, the shadows of the sunlight going through it get revealed, the volume of the shadows gets revealed by the fog. But really kind of the most important aspect of it for me is this idea of appearing and disappearing. So every 2 minutes, the fog appears and becomes this major sculptural, visual intervention, and then it evaporates and it vanishes. And again, kind of going back to some of the insights of quantum physics, particles and waves and fields can appear out of the void, can appear out of the vacuum of nothingness. They can have an action that you can measure, and then they can vanish back into nothingness. And so when scientists discovered this idea of kind of virtual particles that can appear and disappear, it was so contrary to our normal experience of everyday life that they were sure it was wrong. But experiment after experiment has proven that that is actually the nature of reality, is that it can appear and disappear. So and most sculpture, you know, most traditional sculpture, traditional architecture, you know, it's there. And so I'm super intrigued with the idea of something that can appear and then completely vanish and then reappear. This is another recent project. Again, a super brutal parking structure. You know, tragically, it's become a lot of my work is mitigating these really banal, brutal pieces of architecture. This is in Columbus, Ohio, a convention center. We hung these huge curtains of it's a polycarbonate, it's a plastic chainmail fabric. So it's composed of hundreds of thousands of little plastic rings that are all woven together, but they're free to kind of move relative to each other, even though they're all linked together. So it creates this fabric that has the ability to expand and contract. And so when the wind blows on this fabric, does what you're seeing, it creates waves, almost like waves on the ocean. And so it's almost like a mechanical analogy for the ocean or surfaces of water. So it's a kind of a metallic silver colored, these rings. So, but they just catch the light in really different ways. So sometimes they look white as the colors from the setting sun. They'll take on yellows and oranges and gold colors. It looks really interesting at night, illuminated by the lights from cars. And but again, it has this surreal kind of slowness to it, almost like, you know, people who've seen this video ask me if it's in slow motion, and this is just regular, unadulterated video. So it has this gentle slowness to it, which creates this almost like a sense of being underwater, a sense of kind of a different time scale than you're used to seeing. And so again, kind of this idea of the pixelation, of the granulation of this fabric, kind of taking on emergent properties, interacting with the wind, using it to kind of dissolve the harsh, you know, surfaces of architecture, kind of injecting a natural energy source, a natural flow pattern of wind and light, kind of injecting that into the architecture. And but also the functional needs of a parking structure. They need to breathe. They need to, you know, vent all the fumes from the cars. And so needed to meet codes for a certain amount of open area, needed to be super economical, needed to, you know, hold up to ice and snow and, you know, all the other factors that come into play when you start working outside and with architecture. This is the same material, just a blue version of it, installed temporarily. This was a 6-month installation in New York City. This is the entrance to the Queens Midtown Tunnel. And the governor at the time, Andrew Cuomo, the infamous Andrew Cuomo, came to me and said, we're getting rid of all the toll plazas, the money-taking tolls in the whole New York area, and we're replacing them with these cameras and sensors, and they're ugly, and I want you to cover them. And so a bunch of different ideas, and this is the one that kind of everyone loved, was these curtains that would be animated by the wind and a deep blue to kind of suggest water, because all the toll plazas in New York, they all involve a passage over water. The bridges are underwater, the tunnels, and a lot of these passages, you never see the water. I mean, you go through the Queens Midtown Tunnel and all you see is concrete. And so to create this sense that, you know, the magic of the fact that you're actually driving underneath a river when you go through this tunnel. And so, so it all got approved. Everyone loved it. They had all these questions about longevity and would this distract drivers and would it collect ice and would it, you know, like, and so I talked them into let's try it and see. And so we put up this installation that you're looking at. It was up for 6 months in the middle of winter, crazy storms, and there were zero problems at all. And so it all got approved. It all got engineered, and they bought all the materials for it. And right as they were about to start installing it, Andrew Cuomo, who was at the time planning on running for president, got cold feet and got nervous that he was going to run against Trump and that Trump was going to accuse him of squandering money on art instead of, you know, fixing the roads. And he pulled the plug on the whole project. It all got put on hold. And so literally millions of dollars worth of this fabric are still sitting in crates in New York City's, you know, a storage yard somewhere. And but I'll show you what this was, what it was supposed to look like. So the idea of kind of creating this river of air that you'd pass underneath, and the shadows would be evocative of water, and the moving of the fabric would be evocative of water. So this is just a computer simulation. You know, the actual thing would be much more organic and interesting. And but yeah, all the twists and turns of, you know, working on big public projects, you know, just a panic attack by the governor, you know, causes the whole thing to come to a terrible end. A project in LA for the Union Station, this beautiful Art Deco station. They needed a bridge kind of connecting it with a new kind of bus platform that they're building. So they needed this pedestrian bridge to be able to breathe, but they needed a way to kind of shelter some of the harsh sunlight so people wouldn't get roasted walking through it. And so we covered it with 2 layers of perforated stainless steel. The inner layer is fixed and the outer layer is hinged so it can gently sway in the wind. And so the interaction between these 2 layers creates these very organic moire patterns, interference patterns between the layers. Almost biological looking sometime, like you know, micro photographs of cell structures and tissues, and so this whole bridge is very long. So it takes, you know, 5 minutes to walk the whole length of it, and so the whole bridge becomes kind of a light and shadow experience, and the shadows have this gradation to them, almost like a sedimentary rock, but constantly changing. And you see through it, you know, you see the cars going by, you see the shadows. So it doesn't feel oppressive in there, but it basically transforms this whole interior of this bridge into something soothing and kind of, you know, linked to the atmosphere, linked to nature, linked to the people walking through it too. The shadows get projected onto the people, and yeah, most of the people walking through this bridge, you know, they're rushing to get home or to get to work. So just a lot of stressful mind states. So the idea of the artwork kind of being something to soothe people, to create kind of a healing, you know, moment in their life, and you know, something to mitigate the harshness of this necessary kind of pedestrian connection. A sculpture that we just installed in Seattle, the new international arrival terminal at the airport there. So there's a motor up at the top that's essentially a ceiling fan motor, and it's just spinning 1 bar, and all the other bars are linked together with magnetic fields. So basically this invisible magnetism sculpts this whole form into this helical structure. And then every few minutes, the motor slows and reverses direction and reorganizes. So just the top bar spinning, the magnetic field, the magnets are basically arrayed so that each bar magnetically repels the next bar. So the magnetic field pushes them, so the bars never touch each other. So it's totally silent. And the title of the piece is Magnetic Anomaly. In a lot of maps that the pilots use, there's these places on the Earth where there's magnetic anomalies, and they're marked on like aviation and navigation maps. And it's basically a place where you can't trust your compass because something strange happens with the magnetic field of the Earth. And so, so the idea of this artwork is kind of these kinetic mobiles that are powered by this invisible, strange thing we call magnetism, which no one really understands. When I was, you know, in my early 20s, I landed this job working at the Exploratorium, the Science Museum in San Francisco. I was a apprentice for the first couple of years working for Frank Oppenheimer, the physicist who started the museum. And I had all these questions about magnetism and quantum reality and gravity. And I would pepper Frank with these questions, and almost all the questions would kind of reach a certain point where he'd say, well, actually, no one really knows the answer to that. And it was a revelation for me, because I had this idea that science kind of had most things understood, but all these super basic things, gravity, magnetism, light, like we know how to manipulate them. We know how to like do things with them. But when you really ask, like, you know, what are they? You know, what is light really? It's a profound mystery. Gravity is a profound mystery. Magnetism is a profound mystery. And so I've been intrigued with kind of those edges of science. All right, so those are all kind of completed projects, and now I'm going to show you some things in the works, and this will dovetail with some of my collaborations with Pablo and some of our our fantasies of amazing artworks out in the desert of Saudi Arabia. All right, so a year or two ago, I get a call out of the blue from a company that's curating artworks for a new city that's being built in Saudi Arabia called NEOM. And the whole intent of NEOM is to create a city that has no fossil fuel burning anything, that all the power for this whole city comes from the wind. And so to make this whole city wind powered, they need this vast array of wind turbines. It's going to be the largest array of wind turbines on the planet. And so they design this huge array of wind turbines, and they show it to the Crown Prince, the infamous MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. And he says, well, it's sort of cool, but it needs to be cooler. He said, see if you can find an artist to turn this whole field into like a Christo scale environmental artwork. And so with that command, they somehow find their way to me. And I showed them, you know, so they asked me to think about something that would make these wind turbines beautiful and interesting. And so Pablo and I had just finished an ill-fated proposal for using this chainmail fabric over one of the entryways into the city of Riyadh. And so I started thinking about, like, what if we modified these wind turbines? These are huge turbines. I mean, they're, you know, 100+ meters tall. So the idea was to hang a giant kind of tapered sheet of this chainmail fabric that I showed you kind of rippling on the parking structure in Columbus, Ohio. Hang that from the backside of the wind turbines so that it would function as a counterweight to the spinning blades, but also as a vane to always be pointing them directly into the wind. And so I met with some wind turbine engineers, and they loved the idea. It solved a bunch of engineering issues for these turbines for them. And so I proposed the idea of putting a huge sheet of this fabric on every one of these turbines. There's thousands of them. And they loved the idea. And so it kind of got worked into the design, but then they came back to me and said, all right, this is going to be so amazing. People are going to want to see it, but it's, you know, kind of a hot, you know, harsh place to go visit. Like, we need some kind of shaded structure, or like a visitor center for when people go to see this huge wind turbine. And so I took that kind of need, and it morphed into this idea of creating kind of a museum dedicated to understanding the atmosphere of the earth and the wind. And Pablo was my great collaborator on this. And so I'm going to show you what we came up with. All right, so this is just a proof of, you know, concept of, you know, what a vast array of these fabric interventions into the turbine field would look like. But the real thing would be so much more interesting, because each turbine would be kind of pointed at slightly different directions. They'd be rotating with the wind. The fabric would be doing really interesting things. As the turbine blades spin, they create turbulence that would be revealed in the fabric itself. And so So here, let me show you, let me go click on this and full screen. All right, so so this was the idea that Pablo and I hatched of kind of this building that's almost like a vessel of wind. So you'd see this thing kind of rising out of the desert. The entire skin of this structure would be open, but would be covered with a lattice work of individual elements that would move in the wind. So kind of like the piece I showed you, the installation in the pool at Zeiss with all these kind of almost like metallic grasses. So if you can imagine something like that, overlaying this whole structure, and then creating kind of, again, this idea of dappled light, kind of mitigating the harsh sunlight, but essentially revealing the interaction of this structure with the atmosphere of the earth. And then in the center, a giant swirling cloud of mist that would be injected in a radial pattern to create a tornado-like vortex that would function to cool the whole space. So kind of the drone view of it gives you a sense of that would also become kind of an ecosystem, kind of a landscape environment. And Pablo's kind of taken the lead and kind of thinking about this as a super interesting an oasis. So, you know, tying it in with your project there, but a complex oasis that's morphing and changing as you enter. So basically, you'd walk up these steps. You could walk kind of underneath the dome and enter the interior space, or kind of to the left, there's a way you could enter kind of into the interior space. Both are spiral ramps. So the interior space is basically, you'd enter to the left and you'd ramp down to a series of kind of subterranean exhibit spaces, kind of all immersive environments inside that would reveal different aspects of the wind and the atmosphere of the earth and the air, some linked to the data being produced by all the wind turbines, using them as a wind visualization, a room of kind of sand dunes that you could walk over a glass floor and see a kind of a windswept landscape appearing and disappearing. So there's all these interior spaces, but then there's also the experience of going inside the dome. So this vortex would change constantly with the wind and the humidity, and it would become kind of a projection surface for the light, for all the shadows, and the light bouncing off of the kinetic elements of the skin would be projected onto the fog itself. So as you entered, you'd see this vortex changing and morphing. And the idea with the plants is that from the exterior, you'd go from kind of hot, dry desert plants. As you entered the building, the humidity would increase and the temperature would drop due to the evaporation of the mist. And so the landscaping, as you progress down into this spiral bowl, would get cooler and cooler and more humid. So the plant choices would change to kind of coincide with those microclimates, and the wind would increase. So excuse me. The idea is that the tubular structure that holds up this kind of toroidal dome, the central kind of funnel shape is pressurized with air, and the air, so all these tubes are pressurized with air, and they have small holes that are all aimed tangentially. So that creates a rotating airflow kind of in this funnel. And similarly, the fog sprayers, the mist sprayers, are also aimed tangentially. So all of this is being injected with a rotational energy. And so as it falls, that rotational energy amplifies, gets stronger and stronger. So as you walk down into this, the winds would intensify, and the kind of winds created by this vortex would intensify. So the trees would be blowing in the wind, and you know, you'd have this sense of almost like you were entering a storm. And then at the bottom, there would be a pool, a shallow pool, and a hole drawing the vortex down into the floor. And it would penetrate down into the subterranean, the basement of the structure, where there'd be a series of fans and blowers kind of pulling this air down, but then injecting it back into the space kind of through the exposed edges of the floor planes. So, and again, you'd be injecting it all in a tangential rotating pattern. So augmenting this whole storm-like airflow pattern in the whole interior. And so you'd view it from all these different vantage points in this platform as you were descending. Then in the center, you could be, you know, the fog would spread out, and you know, there'd be places where you could be immersed in it. And then many points along the way, you can go from this kind of exterior space into the interior spaces, and appreciate kind of the rooms inside. So this is a cross section, a slice through the middle of it, which gives you a sense of kind of the interior gallery spaces and how they relate to you know, the exterior spaces. And yeah, all of this was kind of a napkin sketch and little study models that I did. And Pablo was really the one who kind of took it and made it into an amazing piece of architecture. And so everyone who's seen it has loved it so far. They're getting ready to present it to the Crown Prince, and which is supposed to happen in the next couple of weeks. He's this notoriously fickle guy. So, you know, if we catch him on a good day, like, this project could actually happen. And so we're feeling cautiously optimistic about it. This is a diagram of kind of the heat exchange. So the idea that you're taking in hot, dry desert air, you're injecting mist into it, you're causing the evaporation to cool it. That cool air goes inside this chamber and then gets injected back out into the space. So creating this gradient from, like, you know, hot, dry desert to like cool, like if you were in an oasis, like how it would feel right next to the water, or underneath a waterfall where there's always a beautiful wind generated by the waterfall. Essentially the same thermodynamics as that. And yeah, just the diagram of the rotation, and looking down on the structure to see the rotation of the vortex. In Pablo's first renderings, there were lots of palm trees, and at the last minute, we got this panic phone call from them. We just heard that the Crown Prince hates palm trees. And so I had to call up poor Pablo and say, Pablo, can you change those into some other trees? And so, you know, if hopefully we get the green light to do the final thing, the landscape progression will be a really interesting task that Pablo has foolishly volunteered to lead the charge on. Some renderings of kind of conceptual renderings of what the skin would look like. So again, you'd have to imagine this all kind of fluttering and moving in the wind, and as the wind came from different directions, different amounts of turbulence in the wind, the facade would go from almost opaque to almost transparent, and everything in between. So the light entering this interior space would essentially be controlled by the wind. And so contrary to most kind of lighting of spaces, which, you know, are very controlled, and, you know, these days everyone has a, you know, obsessed with LED computer controllable lighting where you can tune it to exactly what you want. The whole idea of this is to let nature do it, let the atmosphere control the ambient light level of this space. And again, kind of the skin of this building would be almost like the surface of a subatomic particle. You know, when you zoom in on any atom, it dissolves into this beautiful churning sea of unknowability. And so this building would be almost like a giant molecule. And the shape also is evocative of, you know, forms in nature. And, but again, you know, nature is the underlying theme of the whole thing, but it's not pure nature. It's this sort of amalgam, this fuzzy boundary between a human structure animated by natural forces. And so kind of blurring the distinction between human made and nature made. It's, you know, something in between. And yeah, lit by the light of the setting sun. And another aspect to the mist is it also takes the dust out of the air. It's super dusty in the air in Saudi Arabia. The air always has kind of a mixture of earth element kind of mixed into the air. So the mist would clean that. So kind of in the central core of this structure, it would smell different than the ambient air. It would smell clean. It would smell like the smell you get at the base of a waterfall. So how are we doing for time, Pablo? Should we segue into the assignment? Should I keep going? What do you think?
I think we still have time, at least 20 minutes, I would say, Ali.
Yeah, okay. So show some more things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. All right, so this was a new thing I'm working on. You guys are some of the first people to see this. And this was, you know, kind of thinking about what the dynamics of that skin of the project we were just looking at in Saudi Arabia would look like. So these are all counterbalanced so that they come to rest horizontally, different than a number of the other previous projects I've done where they're indexed to come to a vertical position. These come to a horizontal position, but it becomes this very, very sensitive register for the changes of the wind. But one of the things that's interesting and dovetails with the project in Saudi Arabia is that a gust of wind will come and the facade will go from being almost transparent to almost opaque, like within a few seconds. And just super intrigued with this idea of, you know, most facades, they're either clear or they're translucent or they're opaque, but a facade that's all of those things. And, but the wind is the thing that sculpts it. And so if you can imagine that whole skin of that structure having this kind of changeability and dynamic to it. All right, so this was our next crazy project in Saudi Arabia. This is another project like a couple hundred miles to the north of the NEOM project, a development called Alula. And they came to me and they wanted a planetarium. And I said, there's a million planetariums on the planet. Like, I'm going to give you something kind of like a planetarium, but it's going to be different. And they said, that sounds great. And so this is, again, a thing where Pablo took my napkin sketches and made it into something amazing. All right, so the centerpiece is this idea of, you know, most planetariums, if you've been to them, you know, you sit in a chair and there's a dome over your head and they project, you know, images of stars and galaxies on there. But all these planetariums have this flaw that the projection system creates a bunch of light that also like bleeds out onto the rest of what you're looking at. So you can never get blacks. You can never make it look really amazing. But there's new technology that's evolved just in the last few years where they can basically coat the entire interior of a sphere with a super high resolution LED display screen technology that is amazing. And so the idea is to create this spherical experience where you'd walk out onto a bridge, and the idea is to give people an inkling of how amazing the entire atmosphere of the Earth is. And so so there's all these accounts of astronauts who look out the window of their spaceship or the space station and they see the Earth from space, and they're never the same. It's a mystical experience for them, seeing how beautiful the atmosphere of the Earth is and how thin it is. And so I've been working with a company called Axiom. I've been working on the design of an Earth viewing room in a new space station that they're building. And but the whole project has been kind of weird because it's going to be this thing that's just going to be experienced by a few astronauts or like super wealthy people who can, pay to like go spend, a couple days in this new space station. And so I've been racking my brain for like, how can I give other people this experience that these astronauts had that's like completely changed the way they look at the Earth. And so this planetarium comes along and I realize this is the perfect way to let people, normal people like you and I, to have this kind of experience. So the idea is that with this super high resolution projection, spherical projection screen, you'd walk inside this space and connected to real-time data from Earth viewing satellites, you could render ever-changing real-time video of what all the clouds and the whole Earth look like, and you could take it all in at once. And like no one's ever seen that. Even the astronauts from space, they've only seen half of the Earth. So what would it do to our consciousness if we could stand in the middle of this dark spherical void and see the entire complexity and beauty and changeability of the atmosphere all at once? So almost as though the Earth were clear and you were standing in the center of a clear Earth looking out through the delicate, changeable skin of the atmosphere. So that was kind of the heart of the idea. This is the actual technology of all these panels that would wrap around the sphere. So, hidden from view would be all this technology to kind of make it happen. There's a kind of one little a panel of it. And so all those little pixels, you get a few feet back and it just becomes a fluid, continuous rendering. So the idea that you enter this and give people the chance to really have a using their sensory intelligence to take in how miraculous and unlikely the air of the Earth is, and how spectacularly beautiful and how spectacularly unlikely it is that we live on this planet with this thin, delicate layer of this aliveness that we're all breathing right now, that like keeps us alive. It's generated by life. It's the oxygen is created by plants. Even the nitrogen that makes up most of the air cycles through the whole biosphere. And like I think a lot about like how intimate breathing is, how like we're so connected to this atmosphere, but we just take it so much for granted. Like a human can go for, a month without eating and days without drinking water, but like you can only go for like a minute, minutes without air. So like it's just constantly soothing and keeping us alive. And so all this talk of kind of global warming, like it's all appeals to people's kind of fear and like, oh, we've destroyed the world and we're all going to die. And like when people just get freaked out about that, like they just want to do something else instead of really taking it in. So I've had this fantasy, like what if as an artist, we could make an environment that bypasses people's politics and their thinking mind and goes just right to their sensory intelligence and just gives them an inkling of how amazing the atmosphere of the earth is. And maybe that could be a way more transformative thing for how people behave and how they view their interactions with the world and the atmosphere and nature and carbon. And so that's the big idea of kind of, revealing the whole dynamic beauty of the earth. And with this technology, it could just slowly cycle through different modes. So while you're walking through it, it could be the clouds. It could show you how the clouds are moving on the entire planet. Then it could also, all these different sensors that are orbiting around the earth see the earth in different ways. So there's sensors that show you where all the water is, that show you where all the humidity is in the air. So you can get a really, again, a sensory sense of how entwined the oceans and the atmosphere are. And there's ways you can, filters where you can look at the earth where you can just see like carbon monoxide. You can just see this gas that's predominantly produced by human activity. So you can get a real sense of the human influence on this, delicate shell of air that we live on. And so, and you could also link it to the electrical activity. The atmosphere is amazingly electrical. The auroras are an example, but all the thunderstorms on the whole earth are all part of this global electrical exchange and the charged particles from the sun. So again, kind of almost like the electrical activity of a human brain to take in the whole electrical activity of the whole atmosphere at once. I think it could be a super transformative experience for people. So then the idea of kind of inside the sphere, you have this amazing experience, but then the outside of the sphere also becomes a way of visualizing the thinness and the dynamicism of the atmosphere. So a kinetic skin that moves in the wind, similar to what we proposed in Neon, but wrapping around the exterior of the sphere. And so these were just some of my kind of conceptual images of kind of wrapping this sphere with a skin that would mimic the actual ratio of the thinness of the atmosphere to the diameter of the earth, which is something that's been a profound revelation for a lot of these astronauts. Here we look up at the sky and, the air looks huge, but when you're in space and you see the earth against the backdrop of the lethal blackness of the vacuum of space, the thinness of the atmosphere blows people's minds. So to give people an inkling of that without having to fly up into space. So again, I gave Pablo my napkin sketches and he made it into this amazing building. So kind of growing out of kind of some of the thoughts we developed for NEOM, the idea that this building would be almost like would create an oasis. It would create kind of a sub microclimate protected, and there would be interior kind of exhibit spaces, and then the whole interior would be a beautiful, amazing landscape. The sphere would kind of appear to float over a large water vortex that would pour down through the building, similar to the piece we did in Singapore. And there'd be this bridge that would allow you to enter the sphere, pass through it, and experience all these different, experiences of seeing the entirety of the atmosphere. And then looking down on it. So the building surrounding the sphere kind of inspired by sand dunes. There's a certain form, a certain kind of wind that organizes sand dunes into a shape similar to this, but the exterior surface of the dune encompassing building would also have a lattice work of wind animated elements. So it would have kind of pulses and waves into it. So almost like seeing a sand dune in time lapse moving. And then, kind of, again, depicting sort of the energy field, the interaction of the building and the environment. and there'd be a whole subterranean kind of experience too, kind of a magical room kind of underneath it all. And so, yeah, some of Pablo's amazing renderings of it, and slices of it from different angles. And it's a beautiful, amazing place where they want to put this. It's a very untouched part of the world, gets like a couple centimeters of rain every year, and the sand in places is crazy deep. There's places in Saudi Arabia where the sand is a mile deep. And so there's places where it's just a fluid sand dune environment, but then it gets punctuated by these amazing rock formations that are really ancient. I mean, some of these rocks are billion-year-old remnants of the Earth's crust, so super sculptural rocks. And so the building would sort of play off of the landscape, but also the landscape would kind of enter the building too. It would enter the oasis, but would also enter kind of the interstitial space would, so it's almost like this building was a ruin that the sand dunes, so we're in the process of reclaiming and entering. The skin, like the neon project, would function as a partial shade, you know, diffusing kind of the super hot sun and creating, you know, intricate, beautiful patterns of changing light and shadows. The experience of kind of walking up the bridge, passing over this landscape, then sort of penetrating through the skin, passing over the oasis, and then entering into the darkness of the interior sphere, where you'd have, you know, kind of this hopefully mystical experience, and then emerging from the other side and kind of, you know, in reverse order, you know, passing over the oasis and into the other, you know, half of the structure. You'd observe the thinness of the Earth's atmosphere as you were walking over this bridge, and then have this experience of the full magnitude of the atmosphere inside. And so, yeah, and then a view of kind of the space underneath, with water pouring down through the space, and whole series of large-scale immersive artworks related to sand and water and the atmosphere, and just all the way that the wind sculpts the desert sands and the interface with the ecosystems there. And so yeah, instead of a planetarium, an atmospherium. And yeah, a beautiful landscape kind of in this protected, semi-protected zone around the artwork. Yeah, so like all of our other projects in Saudi Arabia, all of this sort of hinges on the whims of the Crown Prince. And I haven't met him, but I've dealt with his, you know, underlings. And the sense I get is he's obviously a complex figure. He, you know, there's definitely, you know, a dark story to the Crown Prince. But the flip side is he has a huge interest in art. He has a huge interest in architecture. He's very forward thinking, kind of environmentally. He knows that Saudi Arabia, the oil economy is ending, and so he wants to make a whole new economy in place. And he thinks that tourism is going to be part of the, you know, equation that saves them. And so he wants to do like super unique, amazing things that people come from all over the world to see. And most of Saudi Arabia is an uninhabited desert, and an incredibly beautiful one. And so, you know, they also asked me to think about, let's see if I have it here. Oh, this is a visualization of what the exterior of the atmospherium dome might look like. So if you can imagine kind of this whole intricate array of all these wind animated elements, basically tracing out the ever-changing topography of what the wind is doing. And yeah, so maybe I'll end with this project. So they came to me after I presented the planetarium, and they said, we also want to do some cool things out in the desert itself. And so I got to spend a week in the desert there, right before the pandemic kind of shut down air travel. So like two and a half years ago, something like that. So the desert's incredibly beautiful there. The sand is incredibly beautiful. And so I just started thinking, like, what if you did something that was underneath the sand, where you sculpted the sand into a giant vortex? And so these were just very conceptual images, but the idea is that in one of these places where the sand is, you know, a mile deep, or, you know, something like that, you bury under the sand basically a huge, you create a bowl like out of concrete or gunite. And then embedded in that bowl is a whole series of spiral tubes that you pump air into. And each of those spiral tubes has a million little holes in it that let the air bubble out. And when you bubble up air under the very, very soft fluid sand of Saudi Arabia, it becomes almost like a liquid. And so the idea is that you pulse these spiral tubes sequentially. So you create these spiral waves of liquidity that take this, you know, this depth of sand and make it into a vortex. And the idea is that this thing would be kind of an enigma, like all the infrastructure that for creating the pressurized air would be located kind of far away and just, you know, piped in there underground. So this thing would just, like, you wouldn't be sure if this was a natural thing or a human-made thing or what. It would just kind of walk that fuzzy boundary between man and nature, and just be a kind of an enigma, something strange to observe, and some, you know, something for people to come see. And then so we're waiting to hear back again, you know, from the Crown Prince of, you know, whether these ideas, you know, catch his interest. And but the people who are kind of organizing this whole project are super loved all this stuff. And so basically, if we get the green light, we're going to fabricate a pretty large prototype of this at my workshop. My workshop is a building that was a fertilizer plant for 50 years. And they had these huge concrete pools that they used to store giant tanks of fertilizer in case anything leaked, they could contain it. And so we're going to take one of these pools and we're going to fill it with sand as close as we can replicate to the sand of Saudi Arabia. And we're going to build you know, as big as we can, a test to see, you know, how this all works. And so so that's hopefully in the works project. And yeah, so just my fanciful renderings of what it could look like, and the flow pattern of the air and how it would sculpt the sand, you know, similar in some ways to the mist vortex inside the neon oculus. So yeah, maybe I should stop there. What do you think, Pablo? And talk about the project. What do you think?
Sure. Whatever you want. I think it's this is a good project to finish. Like when we gave a lecture, our lecture last week, we were talking about like that myth of people being like basically swallowed by the sand. so I think it's good. Like we can move on to the assignment part. But first, I wanted to thank you for such an amazing and jaw-dropping lecture. I think we are all like completely blown away by what you just showed. Like both all of your build work looks really stunning, and all of the new stuff that you've been working on is very mind-blowing. So thank you for sharing your work with us, Ned. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pablo. A lot of those things would not have happened without your brilliant input and design and rendering skills. And so yeah, and basically, just coming up with one of these ideas is just the beginning. It takes a lot of work to like realize these things. So Pablo is a huge part of this.
That is fantastic. It's very nice to have both of you here in the workshop, and Pablo leading the taller de especialidad you called here. I think it's been really mind-blowing, as Pablo said. All of your projects are really interesting. I think that there is, like you said, there is something about the possibility that the project, ¿cómo se dice? That these particles disappear at some point. I think that concept is really interesting. How your projects, in a way, try to mimic with what happens in natural processes, but also how they disappear within the landscape. I think that has impressed me a lot. Also, what you were saying about this emergence, and how like this little definition of movements produce like large scale transformations. I was thinking about Steven Johnson and Michael Batty, and how they define, for instance, the flock of birds and the flock of fishes, and how you can mimic those movements of that in natural processes occur like very simply, and how you can do it with these tiny particles and these hinges. I think that part of those elements can be very well used by our students when they go to Tamarugal. Perhaps what we can do now is we can stop the presentation, and I'm going to switch to Spanish for a second. Les quiero dar las gracias a todos los que están online. Nosotros vamos a seguir porque esto, como es parte de un workshop, ellos van a dar una tarea ahora, así que les agradezco mucho que hayan participado, espero que les haya gustado. Esta presentación va a quedar disponible en el YouTube del Magíster de Paisaje, y queden atentos porque vamos a tener más presentaciones y charlas bien interesantes, así que muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.